A warm welcome back. My name is Tom, and this is Get Nuanced. And in this particular segment today, I would like to talk to you guys about a very interesting and relatively well known, if you're someone like myself who is interested in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and in particular the early Middle Ages, which in my previous segments I've been recently talking about at a pretty decent length, and I definitely recommend you check out the other segments if you haven't. But in this particular one, I would like to talk less about a series of events rather than a person, I think, that is involved with a series of events, obviously, in this process of history, which, like the ancients, we ourselves are living within and subject to, in terms of the circumstances and how narratives are shaped and how our destinies are determined or not determined in terms of the outcomes and whatnot. But I digress. In this particular edition, I would like to talk about a certain Procopius of Caesarea, who I'm sure, if you're a history buff like myself who's interested in Byzantine studies and late antiquity as well as ancient Greek history, you have heard of him at least in passing, or have heard from other YouTubers who talk about these types of stuff, events that were used in terms of their basis for understanding them. The primary source was none other than this Procopius, who was considered by some as one of the last major historians of the ancient Western world, and he himself is considered within the late Latin tradition, as he wrote in Latin himself, as well as he was also writing in the inspiration of Herodotus and Thucydides in particular, who themselves were Hellenic historians. Herodotus, who is known in the West as the father of history, and had a very detailed account of the ancient Greeks as well as the Persians and Egyptians. And in the tradition of Thucydides, who wrote his On the Peloponnesian War, which is a very important piece of literature which I cannot recommend enough if you haven't already checked out, that talks at length about how a land and sea-based power in Sparta and Athens respectively and inevitably clashed for supremacy over hegemony within the broader Greek Aegean sphere of influence, which was at the time in ancient Europe one of the cradles of civilization in terms of European civilization, at least. And when it comes to the current dynamics between China and America and the geopolitical tensions, oftentimes the comparison is made to the Thucydides trap situation, which potentially an inevitability when two great powers are in conflict and have conflicting interest in mutually shared spheres of what they deem as their backyards for influence, which the U.S. in its particular case in Washington, as well as with Beijing and China, are both imperialistic states which have their own interest. And I think certain lessons can definitely be learned and parallels can be drawn in that sense with this particular tradition of history. And I think with Procopius in particular, he is such a fascinating fellow that, in myself, who is someone who's a history buff, an aspiring student of history and international relations, who has a podcast and YouTube channel which discusses this stuff, I think one of the heroes in my personal book and role models, just as someone myself who has a history obsession, I guess, in lack of a better term, which I'd like to prefer to call a dedication if you want to connotate it in a positive light, which, be the judge of that which you deem fit when it comes to how you semantically identify my, intentions. But I'm just going to put them all on the table, and you can interpret what I say as you wish or don't. It doesn't make a difference at the end of the day, but hopefully we all learn and improve our perspectives. That's what my goal is. Not sure about yours, but when it comes to Procopius, who really gives a broad outline of a complicated and highly interesting period of history, which marks a fundamental epoch, which, despite the aspirations of the emperor, whom Procopius in detail, in much of a contradicting light that is very much Byzantine, considering the contrast of his public works, which were meant for, the contemporaries of his time to consume, which a lot of it was embellished imperial propaganda, similar to what you would expect out of Washington or the Kremlin or any sort of Chinese intelligence agency that would be doing that type of public relations sorts of work, where they somehow can get away with framing war as peace, and these people who otherwise might not have been deemed as worthwhile leaders are able to achieve their political legitimacy through the aspirations and claims that are bestowed upon the state that politically has the Greco-Roman tradition in the case of this state that Procopius was a part of, and this broader civilization that in a way to this day many European, and in the case of the United States, which was settled up here originally by the Europeans, which created the early version of what became the United States. And now, as someone who is a Korean American who was actually adopted and is here speaking English, understanding my particular circumstance and contextualizing it in the broader narrative of history and recent 20th century affairs, which, to not digress too much, are nonetheless part of this process, which, whether I personally have any sort of inclinations to feel one way or the other, as much as Procopius might have in his particular circumstances, as historians we need to divorce ourselves and apply an academic sense of impartiality to the best of our ability when separating our personal position in history. As someone as Procopius, I believe, when now providing his background, as I will in a second, it will show that he himself was someone who was deeply conflicted. And if you understand his primary works that he has used in terms of being a key eyewitness to many of the momentous events that defined this period, the era of Justinian, in which he attempted to, through the Rinvado Imperii, his partially completed restoration of the Western Roman Empire, which since 476 or 480, depending on if you claim Augustulus or Nepos respectively as the last Western Roman emperor, regardless of who you choose, that period, Odovaker and then later Theodoric the Great, had ended up carving out an independent state that was only nominally subject to the whims of Constantinople, and the independence was pretty much in clear display, with a civil aristocracy of native ethnic Romans governing affairs in the civil sense, but with the ultimate power as well as the military, which was the much in tradition of the, and such as the Christ of the 3rd century, where the legions, at the end of the day, not the Senate, were the ones calling the shots. At the end of the day, the Germanic overlords, in the case of Italy with the Ostrogoths, with Theodoric the Great, they were in particular the ones who truly had the overarching power. And Praetorian prefect like Liberius or others who might have had good authority over much of the civil affairs, nonetheless were not the ones anymore who could claim that they were the ones in full power. And that was something that Justinian attempted to rectify through his successful attempt at restoring Italy, Africa, and parts of Spain under the control of the empire, which I'll discuss in later segments and others have discussed at length. And the source that is used for these events to understand them in their broader context, as well as having someone with first-hand experience, as Procopius traveled with and served as an advisor for Belisarius, who was the chief general that Justinian had put in command of the successful reconquest of North Africa, Roman Africa, from the Vandals, which included parts of Libya, Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, as well as the area that is known as Tunisia today, Algeria, and Morocco, the areas that are the former heartlands of the Carthaginian Empire. And Carthage, after the Romans during the Third Punic War, which around 145 BC, they had finally defeated the Carthaginians and had pretty much ethnically cleansed them and salted the earth in a metaphorical way of that area, and then rebuilt Carthage as a central hub for their African command. And for the most part, that area was mostly peaceful and was used for its fertile land, which provided grain and helped feed the Italian heartlands, and as well later in the Western Roman Empire with Carthage being lost to the Vandals, which I'll discuss in another segment under their king at the time, Gaiseric. this was something that was one of the fatal contributions towards the final fall of the Western Roman Empire. And the failed attempts during the reigns of Theodosius, Majorian, and Leo I, which, with the last, was the one that really was the lesson that the Byzantines at the time were trying to use, or the Senate at least, with John the Cappadocian being the only one who was, able to really, due to his position and relationship with Justinian at the time, and being the Praetorian prefect of the East, being able to provide a strong disagreement when he sought to enlist the invasion of, North Africa, which had historically met with disaster after disaster, and in particular, Leo in 468's failed invasion, which, he bankrupted the East, was the key reason that they sourced. That was, for the state, a traumatic experience that decades on, for those even not alive or fairly young at the time, was still something that was deeply ingrained, and as a warning that was in the later Roman Empire, which was far less aggressive and on the defense more often than not, was something that they wished to play it more safely with, which is something to note, interestingly enough, when it comes to the foreign policies of the Byzantine Empire, which is another interesting discussion for another time that I will discuss later, but something to just, bookmark for another discussion that is interesting in and out itself. But when it comes to Procopius in particular, and his background, not to delay this any further and to segue this back, he was a prominent late antique Byzantine Greek scholar from the Roman province of Palestina Prima, and in particular he came from the city of Caesarea, and Caesarea at this time was a former intellectual hub of Roman intellectual learning, and had a huge library, and was originally inaugurated by the Herodian client king Herod the Great, initially during the time of the Augustan Principate in honor of the Romans, and the client state then became part of the broader Roman Levant, including the former areas of Judea, and then there's Roman Syria, the Levant, where Lebanon and Syria are today, as well as Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and those areas that, and Jordan too, I think, all these areas that are pretty important today, and at least when it comes to modern geopolitics, international relations, which this historical context here should definitely be helpful towards understanding this stuff when I talk about it later. But in particular, Procopius was ethnically a Samaritan, whom biblically is comparable in terms of their religious orientation with the Jews, but the main contrast between the two groups in particular is that the Samaritans contrast and depart with their beliefs when it comes to the particular site of their holy place, and the Samaritans are the people that stayed, and the Jews are the ones who came back after the captivity of Babylon, who were helped by Cyrus the Great, who under the Achaemenids had conquered the remnants of the Babylonian Empire and had allowed the Jews to return to Judea and free the Israelites. Historically that was an important event, and that in turn caused them to have their experiences in Babylonian captivity a divergence in their cultural and religious identity that for the ones who stayed inside of this historical area, which to this day there only is about 820 according to sources that I will link in the description below, left of these ethnic peoples, but they have been a staple throughout history that are still in a small number existent today and hopefully continue to persist despite the decrease in their numbers. But in ancient times they were far more plentiful, and despite prior to Procopius's history career as a historian, two different Samaritan revolts, which under Zeno and then under Justin, I believe, they had to put down, and in between I'm sure their Astasius also had to get involved with something of that kind of event. But I think Zeno in particular especially dealt with the Samaritan revolts, correct me if I'm wrong, and in crushing these revolts, the Samaritans, who largely were then afterwards persecuted for their, rebellious nature, would, and as a way to escape persecution, convert to Christianity and therefore Romanize. And many of the Samaritans already were integrated very much into the Hellenistic urban late antique civilization that the Romans had adopted from the times of the successor states of the Diadochi of Alexander, and the embedded Hellenistic influences of the era in between the time of Rome conquering with Pompey the Great after the Third Mithridaic War the Levant, which to this day, including the other areas such as the Sinai and Egypt and the rest of North Africa, with the exception of, I mean, not with the exception of, with this period, with this area being conquered, my bad, and under the control of the Roman Empire for centuries thereafter, this area became deeply prosperous and wealthy, so much so that the capital of the Roman Empire itself relocated to Constantinople in the east, and that city was built on top of the ancient settlement of Byzantium, or Byzantion, which the Greeks referred to it as. And this caused, unintentionally, a Hellenistic influence to really, which was already there from the early Roman Republic, with the senatorial elite learning Greek as a language of culture, much like medieval courts later would adopt French in other courts beyond the French court, such as in Spain, to show their cultured upbringing. And now English is now becoming that international lingua franca. But for the Mediterranean at the time, Greek for the Eastern Mediterranean was the lingua franca, and the Latin of the time of Procopius, which he learned from his experiences, which most likely than not he studied at the law school of Beirut, which was not too far away from his native Palestina Prima, in particular the city of Caesarea Maritima, which again had its own library, which despite its late antiquity showing the gradual decline of these once prosperous not too long ago cities that really thrived. Think of the Five Good Emperors and the Pax Romana, which really saw these areas with having few incursions and prior to this period suffering very little, to the point where they were still more prosperous than many of the Latin Western areas that, even though it was the native Roman homeland, nonetheless were not as economically productive. And ultimately, under Constantine and his successors, the gradual shift geopolitically to orient towards the east and the priorities of such, despite the numerous threats in the east with the Persians and the Balkans under the siege of the migrating German and later the Central Asian Hunnic and Avars and Slavs, these tribes that are even to this day still staples of the region. They still thought that this region was more worth their prioritization, and this is something that even Procopius notes, as he believes that the Romans at this time were Hellenized, and he himself had primarily been a native person who spoke, despite being a Samaritan, Greek, and I'm sure he probably knew his native Samaritan, but was more familiar with Greek, as that was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, and many of the former Anatolian and Syriac populations that prior to the Hellenistic and Roman periods had their own native languages. Many of them had assimilated into this broader Hellenistic culture, which even Rome itself had became ensnared with, and the analogous conqueror being conquered, or the master becoming the slave, is something that is pretty interesting and analogous when it comes to how the Greeks had really much like the later Muslims conquering the Persians and them having a synergization. They really had this similar sort of cultural diffusion with each other. And at this point, with Constantinople being based in the east and New Rome being the new center of Roman affairs, this Greek-centric area that was already Hellenistic and urbanized had continued that influence and had ultimately made late Latin a very much ceremonial language, which was still used in military affairs even after the days of Procopius for a little bit onwards, and in the coinage up until the 7th and 8th centuries. But for the most part, beyond the ceremonial, court, and military rituals that were, ancient traditions, but nonetheless becoming vestiges of times long past, Procopius, as much as with his contemporaries who complained about the ominous likelihood that in the legal laws which were being codified and are still to this day the basis of jurisprudence in the West and in the Eastern European area, in particular with Russia, the Code of Justinian or the Corpus Juris Civilis, this was still something that was, despite being initially penned in Latin, translated for the most part to the mostly Greek-speaking inhabitants of the Eastern Mediterranean, and wouldn't be primarily used in the Latin-speaking areas of the West until it was later rediscovered during the much higher period end of the Middle Ages towards the Renaissance. And this is just a more stunning example of how Rome became essentially a Hellenistic, culturally Hellenistic, yet politically Roman place, yet nonetheless was defined by its contrasting Christianity that shifted much from the classical pagan pantheon of divergent but overarchingly with this cult of the Caesars in Rome, which would be enforced by some of the more autocratic emperors such as Caligula or Domitian by the means of legislation. And this is something that nonetheless, I think, even if you understand how the Neoplatonic framework was integrated with Christianity under the Church Fathers, and even though the Christians persecuted the pagans, which I'll get into another segment, they nonetheless had adopted much of the ways in which rhetorically the Neoplatonists had used to promote their own, intellectual schools and their own arguments for their own doctrines. And there is a synergy with that and even later Islam, and there is a connection between all these things, which is a better discussion for another time. But in particular, Procopius, and especially in his writings, which is even noted by Gibbon, he is a very much lukewarm Christian who admits that he was one of the types whose family converted out of expediency and to avoid persecution, not really out of any sort of deep moral religious conviction, which is noted. But in particular, he was an ethnic Samaritan who his family actually nonetheless were already, despite being natives and non-Greeks or non-Italians, which this just goes to show after the Antonine Constitution of Caracalla in 212, and how Roman citizenship now really enfranchised many of those in the native areas who prior wouldn't enjoy the same benefits of civitas or citizenship. This really goes to show now how, at least in late antiquity, the later Roman Empire was still very much multi-ethnic and far more monocultural, but nonetheless multi-ethnic, and at the same time something that was still transforming. And transformations were something that Procopius would note, but he would even highlight and contrast his experiences with that of the former historians which he used to familiarize himself. And he understood the Roman identity and Hellenistic culture as someone who was from this eastern province of modern-day Palestine and Israel / Jordan. And in particular, he is somebody who lived from 500 AD to 565, which is a pretty long period, or sometime after 565, and was able to foresee pretty important events, which I'll go over in a couple of minutes more in detail. But to keep in mind with Procopius in particular, he is somebody who really shows how the inner workings of the court, and with his secret history in particular, which, contrary to his history of the wars, the buildings, which were more so meant to be the, the product of the patronization of the arts, and how the historically, during the High Roman Empire, the emperors would have aristocrats or members of the Senate pen histories for them to use as ways to celebrate and highlight and also document the events, which obviously had a political twist to them to some degree, but nonetheless were indicative of a broader historical narrative, which to this day we use to ascertain and understand how events preceding ours took place and what circumstances in one way or another led to their outcomes, and what lessons we can grab from otherwise potentially, events that really are distant from us and might seem divorced, but are still, I think, when you understand how their lessons can be applied, very much pertinent to events today, especially when you understand how much of a period of transition we as modern observers in 2020 of history, and fortunate enough to live in a period of advanced technology such as the internet, are going through. And I think that this helps contextualize and nonetheless shows a lot of similarities or parallels, but are nonetheless, not exactly precise, but are indicative of broader trends. And when it comes to Procopius in particular, who highlights weather events, which are obviously incorporated into the broader backdrop of the campaigns of Belisarius on behalf of Justinian. These events, which of natural occurrence, are showing the late antique Little Ice Age and a period of transition both from a geographic and a political and social level, with the plague of Justinian from 541 to 542, which in the secret histories, I think, considering even my own personal disagreements and critical nature when it comes to Justinian, and even every politician who deserves, I think, an analysis and a genuine observation, and are all subject to criticism. And I think criticism helps when it comes to improving. Even those who might disagree, I think, deep down should understand how that can be a reasonable point of view nonetheless. But when it comes to Procopius, who clearly has biases, and in his secret history, which really was meant to be life insurance and something that later people were to read way after the times and people that he was employed under were no longer alive, as he was even himself cited to have feared that eventually someone would get their hands on it before it was meant to be released, and it would show to Belisarius, Justinian, and Theodora reasons for them to want to kill him, because he was very critical, despite his, sycophantic approach that was very much, a standard for the historian in the court of a monarch who obviously wouldn't tolerate you bashing them when that whole job is meant to be a public relations effort, not something to smear. But nonetheless, with the secret histories, which shows a much more disillusioned man who, after coming in his early 20s, an age close to myself, who's a millennial born 96, into the Constantinople from what was really a more provincial background in an albeit rich and wealthy province in this Near Eastern area that was still, for centuries, under Greco-Roman rule. He came to Constantinople, which himself was much like someone who was born, I guess is a good analogy, in an area like rural Florida, which I live in Tampa right now, and I visit the rural areas, and I think it's not necessarily better or worse, but a different way of life, and in particular, how much it would contrast for someone who's spent their whole life in an area like that to visit a city like New York City or Los Angeles. How much of a contrast that would be. It would be just as similar when it came to contrasting the difference between his province of Palestina and going to Constantinople, which at the time was the beating heart of a very much still existent Roman Empire, one in which still, nonetheless, was attempting to reassert itself and was going through an identity crisis politically, so much more considerably, indicative of its Hellenistic and, Roman conflicting nature, and its still attempt to look westward, with Justinian being an epoch who, despite his attempts to mark the restoration of Roman rule, really meant his reign, ironically, more so than anything, kind of marks the end of an era and the final assertion of Rome's attempt to be a true superpower in the Mediterranean, which shortly after, in the 7th century, which we'll later discuss, was through a series of wars and the aftermath of the population decrease and loss of revenue and resources, as well as the civil unrest and religious tensions that alienated even the province that Procopius came from, their native populations, which were of different religious orientations from the very much persecution-minded and intolerant central authorities in Constantinople, which Justinian, of much chagrin to those who understand this folly, had himself been the sort of, epitome of this last attempt for the Roman emperor to truly be both in practice and in principle, and in theory, the, Ecumene, the universal emperor of the world, who was meant to be the vicar of Christ on earth, and this, universal emperor of this universal kingdom, which was a reflection of the heavens. That was something that obviously was clearly proven with history not to be the case, but is nonetheless an interesting thing to understand, and I think a civilization that nonetheless developed and survived throughout almost another millennia afterwards, and goes through a fundamental transformation that reorients itself, whether we're talking later about another segment, which I'll do on iconoclasm, or the later Macedonian Renaissance and the following era with the Alexios, the Komnenos, and the periods also with the struggle between the Dunatoi and the civil administration, which marks a lot of similarities, I think, today with our different interest groups that tend to just dispute within the United States in particular, and are also similar to the oligarchies in Russia or China. And that's something we can discuss in another segment, but in particular with Rome, which itself had criminal violence, criminal mobs, and like the underworld with these different circus factions like the blues, the greens, the red, and the blues, which are interesting parallels themselves, as well as the plague and other things. Procopius gives us, perhaps sometimes embellished or politicized, yet nonetheless a very vivid and riveting account of these events as he perceived them. And I think his works, which I'll include links to some of those in the description, are of great interest and value to any history buff or somebody who wants to better understand this period and the significance of the events which define the late antique culmination and transition eventually thereafter, after the reign of Justinian, to what became the early Middle Ages, and how the reign of Justinian in particular had really defined this culmination of what started with Diocletian and Constantine and evolved from what originally started as the Roman Republic and then the early Roman Augustan Principate to this very much different, yet nonetheless stemming from the same origin empire that truly is to this day we're subjected to a lot of the events that took place within it, and to a large degree we're not really orienting ourselves enough and understanding the perspective of this empire, and much so focus more on the ancient Greek and Roman, forebearers that prior to the Byzantines, whom up until very much recently, especially with the Enlightenment Renaissance, were looked at critically. Nonetheless, Gibbon is actually a matter of fact who wrote the famous Decline and Fall on the Roman Empire, which I definitely recommend you all check out if you haven't, and I'm still reading myself, who is actually a fan of Procopius of Caesarea and admires his presentation, especially with his later critical piece of the Secret Histories, which, despite not meaning to be part of the public PR campaign for the emperor, would later really highlight some of Justinian's cruelties and contrast with his sycophantic historical propaganda piece with a more, sober and clearly disillusioned person who you can, I think, really empathize with, obviously despite his elite upbringing, and obviously at the time the elites of the East would learn Latin themselves as a marker of being an elite. They would learn Latin and Greek, despite the ceremonial language of Latin gradually falling out of disuse and eventually culminating with Greek becoming the sole language that would mostly be used, with the exception of coinage, up until the 8th and 9th centuries. And the title of Roman Emperor itself would go from being the Imperator Caesar Augustus to the Basileus, or king, which was already being used in the East, but meant sovereign, or a monarch, whom was something antithetical originally to the Roman Empire and the early Roman Republic, which back in its western roots was far more, not interested in being ruled again by a monarch or someone who had, dynastic pretensions. But this was a different era, and moving to the East had changed its cultural base, and there were some who came with Constantine from the West, but over time this Eastern cultural Hellenic influence that really transformed Anatolia, much like the Turks had transformed what is today modern Turkey, and really Hellenized. And this Roman relocation to the East politically was something significant, but as well culturally is something that I think should be discussed far more at length, and does have a huge factor in how events are configured in our perspective, and why some of these things are particularly narrated the way that they typically are in the West, as we as modern 2020 US viewers have our own biases and worldviews, which ourselves can seem very divorced at times from the Byzantines, despite some of the variables in our particular timeline being reflective or similar at the very least to a notable degree with that of the time of Justinian, among others, and other times in Roman history, which I'll farther on discuss, as well as with other civilizations. But with Procopius, whom becomes disillusioned so much so, if you can see with his Secret Histories, which I definitely recommend you check out, he has a very disparaging view of his advisor, his position as advisor later, and highlights in his On the Wars and on the Buildings with the achievements of Justinian in his codification with Tribonian of Roman law, with that former Corpus Juris Civilius, and then reinstituting laws that would go from the east to the reconquered provinces in the west. despite that, and the Hagia Sophia, which to this day has a significance that I will talk about later and have in previous segments that I still have to actually upload. But this particular thing, which still has a huge amount of importance, a symbol that is still to this day in Istanbul a marker of Justinian's legacy, albeit obviously modified, and now the house of a different religion, which is recently no longer a museum. But that's another segment for another time. And despite the accomplishments of Justinian when it came to these types of things, they really were overshadowed when Procopius considered the partially completed wars of reconquest, the huge extraneous cost, and the emptying of the previously filled treasury for a rainy day that Anastasius had painstakingly, with his reforms of the bureaucracy and the economics of the Roman Empire, had really stabilized in his reign and tenure, something that Justinian himself was eager to, spend on these conflicts abroad and taking advantage of the casus belli of, Gelimer and Hilderic's dispute in the Vandal kingdom, and then later with the Malasuntha and her cousin and husband, Theodahad. And then obviously getting involved further with the Athanagild and Aguila civil war in Visigothic Spain. These were all things that cost tons of money, manpower, and hiring mercenaries or foederati at the time, despite some of the negative stereotypes mercenaries had, which I think are undeserved, nonetheless was expensive, and something that long-term was, considering the raids on the Balkans with the Kutchakers and the continuous tensions between the Sasanian Persians and their proxy wars in Colchis, as well as with the Lazic area and the parts of the Levant, which the Kassanids and Lakhmids under the Romans and Persians respectively had used as buffer states, which raided each other's territories and was a constant geopolitical chess match, which at the time was expensive. And these border cities such as Dara, which were built by Anastasius, that cost money to upkeep, as well as the areas that were lost due to Justinian's Julian the Apostate, who I will definitely discuss in another segment, his noble yet albeit failed Persian invasion, which caused concessions that his successor Jovian had to make in order for their army to escape being completely annihilated in the Persian heartlands after the failed siege of Ctesiphon that Justinian or Julian the Apostate had made. These events all together in tandem had produced a world in which Procopius increasingly became disillusioned, and he had a cooling in his relationship with Belisarius after the seizure of Ravenna and their return to Constantinople. And later, Justinian and Belisarius would have their own broader conflict and the inner court machinations of their wives, Antonina and Theodora in particular, who Theodora was the empress, and Antonina was the wife of Belisarius, whom I think knew each other prior to their marriages and might have actually introduced each other. And Justinian and Theodora have had their own negative accounts by Procopius, who even embellishes and believes that Justinian was a demon who claims others have witnessed him remove his head, and that Theodora herself was one of the devils in human form, as well as the Antonina, and obviously some of the tropes and historical stereotypes, which are still today, some of which we perpetuate, unfortunately, for better or for worse, are incorporated in his accounts. But those are something I definitely think you should check out for their historical context and understand his own bias and perspective as any historian, even as myself have. And I always recommend you guys being skeptical and double checking, not just taking my word for anything, but hopefully learning as I do from these interesting events and people. And Procopius had a long history and career and had the satisfaction of being even able to join the Roman Senate. And at the time of Procopius's accession into the Senate, which he actually had a very interesting line, which I think is worth keeping in note in his secret histories, which I will now recite to you, which really, I think, underscores how much of a departure the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, which we now refer to them. They're both historiographical terms, but this period in which I think this very much Roman Empire culturally embraced its Hellenic identity, and really the captured became the captor. And Rome and Greece pretty much at that point were culturally one and the same for a while, and that's why they identified as Romeos, even up until very recently. These Greek-speaking, politically Roman folks. But that is another discussion for another time, and we could put the semantics aside and read this quote, which I definitely recommend you check out the broader source, which I'll link below. Often the decrees of the Senate and those of the emperor nominally conflicted. The Senate, however, sat only for pictorial effect, with no power to vote or do anything. It was assembled as a matter of form to comply with the ancient law, and none of its members were permitted to utter a single word. The emperor and his consort took upon themselves the decisions of all matters in dispute, and their will, of course, prevailed. And if anybody thought his victory in such a case was insecure because it was illegal, he had only to give the emperor more money, and a new law would immediately be passed, revoking the former one. And if anybody else preferred the law that had been repealed, the ruler was quite willing to reestablish it in a similar manner. And this is just a glaring criticism that contrasts with his public praise that in the secret histories, which was not meant for Justinian to ever have laid eyes on, and I don't think he ever did. And I think Procopius was able to die peacefully in his sleep, like many of the bureaucrats who didn't want to be emperor, who understood the constant blade, sword of Damocles that kind of hung over metaphorically the heads of these all-powerful, so quote-unquote monarchs who very much were vulnerable in more ways than you would expect. And with Justinian, who himself was actually one of the few emperors in later Byzantine times to have a peaceful death in 565, he himself is compared to a demon, is blamed for the pandemic, which I don't think is necessarily a fair, criticism, but nonetheless underscores the deep disdain for some of the more perceived corrupt dealings and the autocratic, absolutist nature of Justinian, which, contrasting with the early Roman Republic and the days of the early Empire, even and the late Republic, even where monarchs were abhorred and the Senate actually was beyond just an advisory body which had nominal authority, were the primary holders of power in the form of the two consuls within the Senate having authority. And even when the late Republic transitioned into the early Principate, the emperors, as powerful as they had become, still had to, in many ways, act and consider the sentiments of the Senate, which consisted of the landed elites and many of the rich traditional families of the Republic, which had enough influence through their patronage networks to, if you completely ignored them in the early Principate, to cause intrigue and actually be a huge obstacle when it came to the preservation and just survival and keeping the head of the emperor, which you can see with Caligula, or in the case of Nero, that there was easily cases in which Praetorian guards or senatorial figures had acted in a way that when they determined the emperor was in a position that he wasn't governing in a way that they liked, or was vulnerable enough, that they would try a coup or oust him, which was successful and was beyond just the early dynasties and can be seen with Domitian and later emperors. But beyond all of that, and clearly that has a context to it, this had all became paramount in how the later empire that became gradually, as we know it today, what is called the Byzantine Empire. It became very much a monotheistic Christian state with a Greek Hellenic culture and linguistic dimension that is definitely important, but politically, nonetheless, was a continuation of this classical empire that was founded in Italy and came from the Republic period in its days that long since passed by the time of Justinian and Procopius, but still very much had, maybe even subconsciously, still impacted the legacy and the trajectory of the 6th century Roman Empire, which Procopius was a contemporary of. And in the case of his upbringing in what was known at the time as Roman Palestine and today's modern Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, as I mentioned recently, the Levant, which was one of the more richer Near Eastern provinces that were so culturally Hellenic and urbanized since prior to the days of the successor states that came before the Roman Republic. This had all made it so that ultimately the Byzantine influence would be dominantly in Greek and not actually Latin, and the early Roman administration having ceremonial Latin still being used in the 6th century, but was still very much waning with more of a minority. And those outside of those who were rhetoricians, such as Procopius, who were ancient lawyers, who were the ones who were the forefathers for those today in the US and others, which use the jurisprudence that is based around the Corpus Juris Civilis, the codified series of laws that from the days of the Republic to the late Empire were codified by Justinian's Quaestor and Tribonian, who later of which Procopius actually in Secret Histories claims was unfortunately screwed by Justinian after his my God, excuse me, I just sneezed, passing at the hands of what was most likely the plague or just maybe old age. His estates were seized, and the legal heirs were screwed over by Justinian, who kept that estate. And in the Secret History, it dwells even further into many diatribes, and maybe some of this is embellished, obviously considering the bias of Procopius, who had a senatorial elite Eastern background that was obviously ethnically Samaritan and one of the many minority groups in the empire, but nonetheless was part of the elite circles of those minority groups, which nonetheless formed a part of the administration and bureaucracy across what was still at this time a very much superpower in terms of its Mediterranean. It's inheriting the Mediterranean supremacy that the early empire had, and still at this time, despite the Vandals and the Ostrogoths at the initial onset of Justinian's tenure as emperor in the east, still being there prior to his attempted restoration, which even saw parts of Spain under the Visigoths partially carved out in a video that I mentioned, or podcast segment that you should definitely check out, that I made recently called Byzantine Spania. This will go into detail about that particular province and more broadly the western conquest that Justinian had attempted to do in order to perpetuate what was this Roman superpower in the Mediterranean, but nonetheless was ironically an epoch, and if anything, contrary to his own beliefs, the beginning of the end of Roman supremacy and being the dominant force in the Mediterranean, as after the 7th century, this would be a disputed area between the Arab Khalifa and the immediate successors and companions of Muhammad, who brought Islam through jihad from the Arab Peninsula all the way through the former great empires of the East, including the Romans and the Persians under the Sassanid dynasty, which was completely annihilated, and the Romans themselves later would lose many of their Near Eastern provinces not too long after, due to the mismanagement and the lack of resources that Justinian's conquest had left, and his successors geopolitically not having the same level of savvy, especially his immediate nephew and successor Justin II, who foolishly mismanaged his affairs in the Balkans to the point where the Avars had completely been able to, with the Slavs, carve out many of the old crucial recruiting grounds for the military and the army of Thrace in particular, which were then permanently after that point demographically changed. And it will be something that you can talk about in another segment for sure, but is something that you should keep in mind is Justinian was from this area actually, and his inauguration of his hometown being reformed from Tauresium to Justinianopolis was, given the trappings in Justinian's life of a metropolitan center, but nonetheless was destroyed not long after Justinian's passing. And despite reigning for 40 years, and reigning very long comparable to the reign of even his early predecessors like Augustus, this nonetheless was an empire in decay, and maybe those at the time, much as anyone who lives during a period of transition, might oftentimes not realize the gravity of circumstance as it's occurring. And being the benefits of hindsight when it comes to the Romans, we can ascertain the shifts and the borders that mark down our accounts when it comes to these sources, and how they've been configured in an academic setting are nonetheless valuable for us to use, but nonetheless should be put in their proper context, understanding the biases of someone not only just when it comes to the historians, but the events, the people, the political and cultural, outlook at the time, and especially myself as a commentator who's just another voice who's contributing and giving their perspective and talking about what they think is interesting, but nonetheless has his own flaws and biases, which should be, something that I always am aware of and trying to improve and overcome, but nonetheless are something that are ever present as we're all subject to the human condition. But Procopius nonetheless knew all of this, and I might have mentioned earlier, actually, my bad, he did not. He was in the late antique tradition and spoke Latin and Greek, but wrote his histories in the tradition of the Second Sophist school, and was a late antique historian, but wrote in Greek and in the, the inspiration of Thucydides and Herodotus, who were two of the greatest ancient Greek historians and are definitely sources I think you should check out, which I'll mention in another podcast and discuss at broader length, as they deserve their own particular segments, as many of these other subtopics do. But with Procopius in particular, his importance as a historian during the late antique period and underscoring and highlighting through his series of works, which I think the secret histories of which is the most interesting and obviously the most scandalous and controversial, as it embellishes some of the events, obviously, for sure, and has its own biases, keeping in mind with a lot of these underscoring and accusations that Procopius might have been at the time even a crypto-pagan, considering his sympathies for the Academy of Athens, which Justinian was purported to have ended, that was purportedly started by Plato and his successors, and had had a golden chain from the time of the classical Athenian period all the way up to the period that Justinian reigned, as he continued to consolidate and enforce an orthodoxy that alienated many of the people who lived outside of Constantinople and even in the home province of Procopius, which would later, not too long after, due to the wars of the Sasanians and the Arabs later, these areas would be lost. And the autumn of the fall of Rome, which really took place longer in the east than in the west, with Constantinople having since long been the main capital and imperial seat of power for the Romans since Constantine's day. And there were divisions and emperors who divided up the empire with separate courts in Ravenna, and Rome was still the spiritual capital, but Constantinople, ever since Constantine and going forward, was truly the heartland the beating heart of this Roman Empire that would last until the 1450s. And that's something that's obviously another discussion for another time. And Procopius would have no idea what the fate of the future would hold, but it's clear in his writings, especially in his secret histories, how disillusioned by the end of his tenure he had become with the court of Justinian, and even those who he was close to formerly, such as his, the general that he followed, who is definitely, for his military accomplishments, a more complicated figure who sounded like with his personal life had a lot on his plate and had dealt with a lot of treachery, and maybe himself might have not been the most upright of people, considering Procopius's fear of the discovery of this secret histories, where he criticized and pretty much called Belisarius, as much as he was a military tactician that was brilliant and comparable to some of the greatest generals and Roman heroes of the past, but was nonetheless to him the modern version of what we would know as a cuck. But we give you the judge of that, and that is a personal ad hominem type of thing, which is something you can be the judge of, but at the end of the day, I think is something we should look at on the periphery and understand that in the broader scheme of things, the secret history is a scandalous and obviously, I think, hyperbolic in many cases account that nonetheless provides interesting and valuable insight that I think you can parse together to figure out the pieces of truth, such as, in particular, which I'm going to recite right now, which I think highlights a lot of this interesting depth of the time and how the Roman government had changed over the centuries, and under the reigns of Diocletian and Constantine, this would further develop with their successors and culminate with Justinian being the just epitome of this late Roman, early Byzantine conception of what a Roman leader or Roman emperor would be, changing from what was the early Principate model of being a first among equals, a super senator, in lack of a better term, to in the dominant, and then in the times of Justinian being this vice-regent, which Procopius will describe, such as Justinian claiming he is the representative for Christ on earth. This sort of, person who, if he isn't a god himself, he is quite much, more than human, maybe the voice of God, much like the Pope claims in Catholicism. But back at this time, beyond the spiritual and theoretical claims, which increasingly became more abstract and esoteric as time went on for the Byzantines, and as their ability to exercise authority and their status as a preeminent power was, gone through periods of decline and recovery that would later, succeed these times in the 6th century. Nonetheless, these periods would underscore the persistence of this civilization that, nonetheless, for its flaws, I think, and some of its, misunderstood concepts that I think are derived from how the West has understood and interacted with the Byzantines during their times and even after, and how we framed them throughout the broader historical narrative and the trajectory of the West, which in our time seems so much more broader, and the Byzantines seem more like a footnote, if anything, at this point, since they're not even around. And arguably, to this point, I think you maybe could have a point when it came to their political state, but when it comes to the makeup of the geopolitical circumstances that define the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and also the Near East, the Middle East in particular, I think it's crucial to understand this area and the Byzantines, the Ottomans, and obviously the Byzantines themselves as the later Romans who were Christianized and Hellenized. But that is obviously another discussion for another time, and let us get into the debasing of the quaestorship, which is one more antidote that I'd like to cite from Procopius' Secret History, but maybe not the last, since I definitely would like to talk about him again in another segment. This is the debasing of the quaestorship, and on top of this, I'll mention again after this how the Roman government had, despite being the same political state at its core that from the time of Augustus onwards, transitioning despite the change in government and how the government was configured and how the state apparatus was composed, with this bureaucracy becoming ever more complicated and what we know now as Byzantine at this time, how these evolutions were taking place and how the events that transpired beyond these theoretical concepts that we're now discussing had manifested and had affected those on the ground, and many of which we still to this day know very little of due to the lack of sources, unfortunately, and many faceless figures who existed that might be our own ancestors or, those who we know, friends whose ancestors existed. I think it's worth understanding their struggles in these times and contextualizing them in a way in which we could better apply them to our current situations and learn from the mistakes of the past to improve our decision making going forward. But that's just my way of analyzing and interpreting these events, and in particular with the quaestorship, which is actually a vestige of the Republic. Procopius lamented here with this, and the source I'll link in the description, keep in mind. He, Justinian, also had contrived other ways of plundering his subjects, which I will now describe as well as I can, which he robbed them, not all at once, but little by little of their entire fortunes. First, he appointed a new municipal magistrate with the power to license shopkeepers to sell their wares at whatever prices they desired, for which privilege they paid an annual tax. Accordingly, people bought their provisions in these shops, had to pay 3 times what the stuff was worth, and complainants had no redress, though great harm was thus done. And for these magistrates saw it, the imperial tax was fattened accordingly, which was to their advantage, and thus government officials shared in this disgraceful business, while shopkeepers, empowered to act illegally, cheated unbearably those who had to buy from them, not only but by raising their prices many times over, as I have said, but by defrauding customers in other unheard ways. Again, he licensed many monopolies, as they are called, selling freedom from the subjects to those who were willing to undertake this reprehensible traffic, after he had exacted his price for the privilege. To those who made this arrangement with him, he gave the power to manage the business how they pleased, and he sold this privilege openly, even to all the other magistrates. And since the emperor always got his little share of the plundering, these officials and their subordinates in charge of the work did their robbing with small anxiety. And this goes on further onwards with how the appointment of the praetor would just be flunkies, and I will paraphrase this to the end point now, as this is actually a lot of text that I think you should yourself read and understand the consequences and how it shows and details the nature of how government worked, or maybe didn't work, for the citizens of the time, which increasingly were more subjects, and how the monarchical nature of the emperor, who really had become and used religion and his authority over secular and spiritual matters to justify his own ends, and many times empower those who were pretty much doing things that were pursuing their own self-interest, but were masking it in some sort of religious altruism that I think is interesting yet cynical, and obviously tragic for those who were victims of the negative effects of which. And in this figure, the certain Junius, who was actually a Libyan, was next appointed to the office after Tribonian, who I mentioned prior, who codified the Corpus Juris Civilis for Justinian, and had unfortunately dealt with Justinian screwing over his heirs. The successor of his was a Junius, a Libyan, who was the next praetor, and he was a man that had never ever even heard the law, in the words of Procopius, for he was not a rhetorician. He knew the Latin letters, but as far as Greek went, he had never even gone to school, and was unable to speak the language. Frequently, whenever he tried to say a Greek word, he was laughed at by his servants, and anybody, this is my personal note, anybody who has tried to learn a new language and is doing so in a way which, obviously, like myself, who isn't familiar with the pronunciations, cannot relate to how goofy someone can sound. And going back to the line from Procopius from The Secret History, he was so damn greedy for these base gain that he thought nothing of publicly selling the emperor's decrees. For 1 gold coin he would not hold out his palm to anybody without hesitation, and for not less than 7 years' time the state shared the ridicule earned by this petty grafter. So this is the ancient form of political grifting, in contrast to how modern-day grifters, which I've discussed in another segment, I definitely recommend you check out if you haven't, do things. But I digress. When it came to these people who were appointed, which used their office for their own self-interest and really disgraced the idea of the Respublica, of this common interest being represented through the state. And maybe there still was the grain dole, the Cosa Sonona, which was subsidizing free food and wine, and there was the entertainment at the Hippodrome. But nonetheless, there was very much ruination and corruption that had become normalized, and abuse of authority, and an increasing police state that was Byzantine by how our understanding of dubious and duplicitous political scheming and espionage, the stereotypes of today that we still apply to other countries that are framed as the baddies, and other states may perceive us as, if you're someone like myself who is an American. But anyways, I digress. And more broadly speaking, when it comes to the Romans here in the 6th century, Procopius shows a period of a roller coaster, a period of saints and sinners, of vices and virtue, and of heroes and tyrants. And I'll talk about Totila and the Gothic War in particular, which surprisingly Procopius had a bunch of positive praise to apply to an enemy of which almost undid and undermined Justinian's ability to reintegrate Italy back into the Roman Empire, including the Eternal City of Rome, which Totila was able to temporarily retake. And Belisarius, who was the general who Procopius had followed around as an advisor, a consularis, who was able to celebrate a triumph, who had dealt with his wife and the intrigues of the court in a way in which Procopius describes very unflattering events that were probably all the buzz when it came to the gossip within Constantinople. And for whatever hyperbole and bias is incorporated that distorts potentially a more realistic and sober reality maybe on the ground for certain events, particularly ones in which Procopius himself, due to his origins and position within the court, potentially might have, had, and would be something in our own considerations that would, in his position, given our potential, chance that we ever in such a position, we probably would have similar inclinations as well, based off of our own personal preferences and upbringing and intrinsic beliefs and things about us that are invariably part of our identity. But with that aside, and understanding that broader detail, when it comes to his painting of a picture of a Constantinople in the 6th century that is, despite its, tragic, obviously, drain when it came to brain drain, and also obviously more broadly the population decrease that came in the wake of the plague of Justinian from 541 to 542, which Procopius, as I mentioned earlier, vividly describes and in maybe some ways hyperbolizes, but nonetheless details a horrific scene in which 25% of the total Mediterranean population of the empire was wiped out, and the population, even after the territorial reintegration of Italy, Africa, and parts of Spain, was still population-wise similar to the time right before the conquest were added. And this is with that new territory, which gives a scope of how much these areas that were highly urbanized, even in the west, the areas of Italy that still, maybe despite being under Ostrogothic suzerainty, were nonetheless still wealthy and had a late antique characteristic to their city life and the life of the citizens, who themselves maybe were being governed independently with a dramatic military class in the Ostrogothic kingdom, and the Roman civil authorities being nominally in the hands of the old senatorial order. These things were, after the plague, never going to be the same, and after the Gothic War, which, more broadly speaking, contrary to the Vandalic War and its success, which was stunning and at the time in its own right worth a broader discussion, but when it came to the Vandal War and its false promise, when it came to its being able to accomplish the same sort of length in terms of the achievement of territory and the duration in terms of how long the campaign took, this was something that didn't duplicate, unfortunately, as Justinian hoped with the Gothic War. And there were quite a number of times where Totila, among others, were able to consolidate and turn the fortunes of the Ostrogoths, who themselves had been able to rally the natives, who increasingly became alienated by the corrupt dealings of the new Byzantine forces, which were seen in a more foreign and Greek perspective by the natives, despite them being politically the successors of the Romans who came from Italy and ostensibly coming as liberators who were trying to restore imperial rule, but nonetheless would face a citizenry in Italy that had potentially been able to, considering the crazy times and the Ostrogothic contrast to the Vandal rule in North Africa, their more tolerant nature towards the ethnic Romans who were natives. This was something that, excuse me as I got a drink, this was something that influenced the natives there and had made them more receptive to Totila, and the inner turmoil of the court, which caused Belisarius to be recalled back and forth, and for his subordinates who were left to not be given any sort of coherent strategy and overarching mandate from Justinian, which caused the inner fighting and bickering with these troops, who were more interested at the time as being self-interested and using the recently conquered territory not in a way which would be, ingratiating themselves with the locals, but instead plundering and raiding and, subjecting the locals who originally were more receptive to the, efforts of Constantinople, but would quickly see that they were treated, if not as bad, maybe even worse, as the Ostrogoths and the Ostrogothic yoke, which was a contributing factor that led later towards the gradual alienation of the Italian peninsula. And even despite the Gothic War inevitably culminating, despite with the impacts of the plague and the climate impacts of the late antique Little Ice Age, which were gradually causing the civilizations at the time, from the Sasanians to the Romans, to the Sasanian Persians to the Romans, to even the Chinese, this was something that had a huge interplay with the shakeup of late antiquity and what became the early Middle Ages. And this is something, I think, when it came to Procopius's placement and his observations of the decadence and decline that maybe was kind of hidden at the surface by the robust and cosmopolitan atmosphere of Constantinople, which, much like New York City, which I came from and was raised in the U.S., at a time when the U.S., I think, as well as I am speaking, maybe in September 2020, might, despite declining with the coronavirus considerably and maybe having a questionable future, at least up until recent memory, was a geopolitical superpower in its own right. And being in this period of transition and decline, in which I would actually even write poems back about in my days back in school, in the public school system in the U.S., for better and for worse, throughout the country, in Florida and New York, mainly New York. But this is something with college and everything that I've seen, and it just comes when it comes to society and the culture and how we can look at the common trajectories that I think Procopius outlines, and to a large degree, shockingly, I think so in many cases, can be considered comparable in a lot of ways to the circumstances which today are the U.S. in terms of its conflicts and the pandemic, and obviously its imperialistic overextension when it comes to its foreign policy, and what might inevitably lead to the fruits of this, as well as when it came to Justinian and his short-term gains that led to long-term problems and exacerbating an already overextended situation which the Byzantines prior to Justinian's conquest had faced with the Balkan migration of the Germans and later the Avars and Slavs, among others, who would carve out my bad. I don't think I have the virus. I just drank a little bit of water, and I'm always trying to watch out because the cat, Kitty, if you hear her, she's on heat, and she always tries to drink out of my glass, and if she does, sometimes I'll cough up, and I'll try to spit it out just to make sure, because you can tell if there's hair. Having cats and podcasting is not that easy sometimes, but on a more serious note, to lighten things up, and it comes to the dark ages that I think are misinterpreted as dark when it comes to the lack of sources, but aren't really when it came to a lot of the areas such as Visigothic Spain and parts of the former Roman West that actually had a lot of the same sort of continuation in terms of the cultural dynamics and the city life, as well as the cultural inclinations. And a lot of the Germans themselves who became Romanized throughout the former provinces, such as the Franks and the former Visigoths, as well as the Ostrogoths, who later were replaced by the Lombards in terms of the main enemy on the periphery in the Italian front for the Byzantines. And this is something that I think when it comes to Procopius and his analysis of events, it really gives us insight on a portrait and a snapshot in this broader historical narrative of a complicated empire that nonetheless chugged on way past what is considered the contemporary and conventional mark for when the Roman Empire ended. And if you were at the time visiting this city, I think it would very much be a joke to claim that the Roman Empire had ended. And nonetheless, it was still changing very much so, and in a period of fundamental transition at the time of Procopius. And his own identity and his broader role as a historian, I think, tell us so much more about the nature in which the political and cultural systems of this late Roman Empire were undergoing gradual yet definitive changes and transformations radically in terms of their political institutions and even the military ones that were used to govern the territories, which increasingly became more consolidated around this Anatolian heartland and this Balkan theater that would be for the majority of the time in between this period and up to the Macedonian Renaissance, started with Basil I, who had a similar background to Justin I, who was the uncle of Justinian and the one who got the Justinianic dynasty up and on its feet at the time of its rise to prominence. Basil I has a similar and interesting history, which I'll discuss in another segment, but in between these time periods, the Balkans was some place in which was really a wild, wild west that formerly consisted of this late antique society that was very much Latin and Roman, but increasingly became synchronized with the migrating and assimilating Slavic and Avar tribes, and then the Bulgars, who themselves adopted and became Christians, and also changed up how they culturally were, and to this day are descendants in terms of the modern state of Bulgaria in Eastern Europe, and the Byzantine legacy in Eastern Europe as well as in the Near East is one that I will talk about at more length, and is one that I think is crucial to better understanding these regions, and the political and cultural dynamics, and how potential solutions for conflicts and what the nature in which these conflicts are configured, how they are there. And it's easier said than done when it comes to obviously these things, but to start off and get a basic understanding to these things, I think, is pivotal to even getting further into the meat and potatoes, which hopefully will be not just my own initiative, but that of others as well who are interested in international relations and improving the landscape of society throughout the world, and in particular if you're someone like myself in the US. But that is another discussion for another time, and with Procopius, who from his accounts of Justinian and Belisarius to his noting of the differing transitions that you can see that were gradual, of whether it's the degradation of past offices or the changing of how the old vestiges of the Roman rule that was still characteristic of the Augustan times, such as making the consulship only exclusive to that of the emperor and ending its nominal electoral basis, which was formerly something that maybe was no longer actually a reality in terms of its practical effects, but was still symbolically used as a way of showing fealty to the ancient law, as I mentioned with the quote about Procopius in the Senate, as well as with the old institutions such as the Senate, which became more of just a rubber stamp that lost its ability and its preeminence to do anything and could give advice, but was nothing that had to be adhered to. And when it came to the patricians, who were previously exclusively the Italian senatorial elite, which made up the early Rome that allowed the empire to become this all-encompassing Mediterranean superpower, this was something that in the East in Constantinople differed, as patricians could be eunuchs after the time of Justinian and his new mandates, and the Senate and patricians themselves were greatly increased when it came to the different officials and friends and family of the emperors, who this became little more than nepotistic and symbolic titles that had a salary attached to them in some cases, but were by no means representing the original intentions of their design in terms of their role in terms of governance. And the Roman Republic, or the Roman Empire, was a republic in name still, and would still be used in coinage to that effect. And those who aspired to pursue the purple themselves going forward from the times of Justinian would portray many of the trappings, at least claiming in principle, more in theory later throughout the history of the Byzantine era and into the High Middle Ages than in practice at that point after Justinian, but would show the symbolic trappings of what it meant to be this new, Christian shepherd or ecumen who was attempting to, both in a secular and spiritual sense, preside over the temporal reflection of what they believed, the Romans, as to be the kingdom of heaven on earth, and as maybe someone as a modern observer in a more secular age, which I think is increasingly being seen now as less so due to recent events. And there's another discussion for another time, but keeping in mind with the recent neoliberalistic secular notions of framing history that I think had some valuable perspectives from them, but nonetheless were arrogant in their suppositions and have been led to seeing our societies under a false impression of what we understood as reality being unraveled through the political process and the Trump presidency, among other things, which is another discussion for another topic and another day. But when it comes to the days of Procopius and our times, and the ability for us to delineate between facts and fiction, and seeing how the secret histories contrasted so much with his on the wars and on the buildings, which lavished praise that was sycophantic to Justinian and obviously was meant to be tongue-in-cheek and was required for his position as a patronized historian within the court, who was meant to be a ancient version of Joseph Goebbels, or someone who is like Kelly McEnany, or someone who's the White House secretary for the press, or whoever the spokesperson is in Beijing or Moscow for their own, political bureau. These types of PR types that I think are, staples of any modern bureaucracy, and in ancient Rome, which later became this more Byzantine Roman Empire in the East in Constantinople. These things were of much lament to someone like Procopius, who showed sympathy for the ancient Platonic and paganistic underpinnings which used to dominate and were more characteristic of the early Principate and late Republic that was seen nostalgically by the Senate and those within the circles that Procopius traveled within, and infers a lot of his own biases as Justinian and his own origins is something that was considered controversial, and that of Theodora as well, that was in a lot of ways one of the many microcosms of broader scandals, which at every point in our history we have political scandals. That's just a staple of any civilized society, I guess, in lack of a better way of describing it. But there are parallels that we could draw from our period that might not be the same as the ones in the time of Procopius, but are interesting to note and contrast with. And I think Procopius himself is an invaluable figure whom I will definitely bookmark and come back to for future discussions, and I recommend we all continue to pay attention to. And I apologize, by the way, in advance for recently or briefly in the video saying that he spoke again Greek wrote his histories in Latin, as he knew Greek and Latin both from his studying most likely at the school of Beirut before the earthquake in his life that he documented that destroyed much of the former ancient center for rhetoricians who themselves were the Roman lawyers of the days of Procopius and before, who practiced jurisprudence, and many of which became senators such as Procopius, or members of the administration and the bureaucracy for the ruling class in Constantinople. And that was one of Procopius's, that was represented in the life of Procopius, who himself came from the provincial center of Caesarea Maritima, which was the capital of the Palestina Prima, which meant Palestine, the first province of the Roman Empire. And he himself primarily was a Greek speaker who was Hellenized and spoke and written in Greek in the second Sophist school tradition, and that was inspired by Herodotus and Thucydides in their type of historical format. But nonetheless, I think his Secret Histories is his most important work, which should be understood for its biases and be looked at in a nuanced capacity. As humorous as some of its more scandalous and hyperbolic accounts can be, provides this valuable scope and insight on a tumultuous period of radical and critical change that in human history has few parallels, and I think ourselves in our period might be able to ascertain some of those similarities in our own time that I think are very much exceptional and were not represented or were not indicative of the general sentiment of those who lived, such as in Constantinople. As someone who would stand in Times Square prior to coronavirus, you would think you were in the center of the universe and that things could never really change that radically, that the belief at the time for Justinian that the Roman Empire would preside as this temporal superpower over the world ad infinitum would definitely, after his tenure, be increasingly challenged, and the iconoclastic controversies that would be later endemic of the alienation between the West and Eastern Christian churches, that even to that point when the Roman See was reintegrated within the Byzantine imperial orbit during the tenure of Justinian, and this Byzantine papacy that didn't stop until the end of the Exarchate of Ravenna, which I discussed in another segment that I recommend you check out, and was indicative of the alienation between the papacy and the authorities in Constantinople, especially with the Patriarchate, that claimed to be ecumenical and was seen as an equal of the Pope, who had disputes over the controversies when it came to doctrinal disputes that were very esoteric, but nonetheless were crucial to the cultural identities and the political circumstances that made up the relationships at the time between the Western and Eastern orbits, the Latin West and the Greek East. And this is something that, with Procopius in his period of transition, these events that happened at this point would make up the landscape that would define the variables that would influence the future events that I just described. And in order to better understand them, understanding this period that happened before is crucial to understanding this post-Western Roman Empire, the remnants, this post-Roman world in the West that became increasingly decentralized and feudalistic, and in the court of Constantinople that still held on and clung on nonetheless after the Arab conquest that I mentioned, which I'll discuss at greater length in the future. They would, despite the Slavic migrations and the Avars, who almost completely ransacked the entirety of the Balkans and the former rich late antique provinces that Justinian himself was from, the changes that would occur due to the reformation of the Roman military legions that themselves to the day of Procopius existed and afterwards were reformed under the theme system with later emperors such as Constans II and Constans II, Leo III, and Constantine V, creating this new system that would succeed the legionary system that long had been outdated. And the Anatolian heartland, or Anatolian plateau, which is now in modern-day Turkey, became the new heartland and the new recruiting ground, contrasting with the Balkans, which was now constantly contested, and with the exception of the coastal centers in mainland Greece and parts of the Balkans, such as the Adriatic, and areas of Croatia, such as the coastal centers that were previously known as Ragusa. This area became largely the hinterlands in control of migrating tribes that assimilated and later became culturally within the Byzantine orbit and shared a lot of the religious aspirations that to this day influence how the demographic and ethno-religious makeup of these areas are, and some of the geopolitical tensions that underplay the broader societies that have disputes depending on how these different beliefs in this melting pot of regions and cause these different groups to have disputes and historical grievances due to even recent events, such as the breakup of Yugoslavia and the stuff that's going on in Kosovo and Serbia, which we can get into in another segment, but important to understand how this late Roman world came before that and how that unification that existed from the time of Augustus to the days of Justinian and his early brief reign of the early tenure of his successor Justin II, and seeing how this was a period that was going to come to an end and was the sign of broader trends. These are all things that Procopius helps emphasize, and I think the follies of Justinian's war and also the triumphs of his attempts to reassert Roman rule should be something that are lessons nonetheless, and we have our own opinions that we can come to when it comes to what should have or could have been done, and in hindsight we are beneficiaries of what already happened, and hopefully we can apply the knowledge that we can learn from these events to our own current trajectories and improve the circumstances that we have by better being aware of the mistakes that were made and also the triumphs that were also done by the forefathers and ancients who make up the shadows that we still kind of walk within. But that's just my way of perceiving events, and if you have feedback, please provide it and let me know what you think. Hopefully you enjoyed this broader overarching tale about Procopius and the times that he lived within, as well as his relationship with Justinian, who for sure was not looked upon well within his own, the comfort of his own seclusion and his ability to write and vent in this secret histories, which is also just a diatribe against his perception of how the court of Justinian was starting off very much idealistic and ended very much as a freak show, and was just something that unfortunately for all of its hype did not end with the benefit of the empire in terms of his own perspective and his disillusionment when it came to politics in Constantinople. But that is something that again can be bookmarked for another discussion that I think obviously should be had, but clearly keeping in mind with the scope of this period, and even a video or podcast this long is still nonetheless not doing a topic this complicated and nuanced justice. And I definitely recommend on your own time giving research and giving some time to do research and taking out some of the primary sources. I'll include some info about that in the description, And I will definitely revisit Procopius and the times that he lived in, which deserve much more attention by not just myself, but many others within the history community on YouTube and the world at large, for those who want to learn something new on a routine basis and apply the information that we are blessed to have from the past into our present day decision making to make better decisions and learn from the lessons of our forefathers and not repeat the mistakes and be doomed to repeat and, you know, relive that old cliche that those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And with Procopius in particular, who shows us so much about the period that is now known as the early Byzantine or late Roman period under Justinian in particular, whose reign, again, as I mentioned, is an epoch. This is something that I think deserves a lot more attention, and I think his own area that he came from, and being a Samaritan who converted to Christianity, which was a hallmark of being considered a Roman, who was a part of this elite court that was able to get an first-hand primary account of the inner workings that might be presented in a biased format. Obviously, he is painting himself in the best of lights, and his perspective colors a lot of his descriptions and how his secret histories is narrated, as well as his main on the wars and on the buildings, which themselves are important sources for understanding the geography, demography, and the religious situation that also Justinian had an influence in, that actually had a huge part in the alienation of provinces, as I mentioned, that were even the ones such as the one that Procopius himself was from. And in later periods, not too long after Justinian Procopius, this area, along with much, again, as I said previously, of the Near East and the old Roman world's key strategic areas and wealthiest provinces, such as Egypt and Syria, those were gone, and Palestine as well. But when it comes to that and this broader story and what happens with the fate of Rome, that will be discussed in further segments, and hopefully you enjoyed this particular one. And if you did, please check out the social media for Get Nuanced. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter, as well as my personal handles, and provide feedback if you can. My name is Tom. This has been Get Nuanced, and hopefully, regardless if you've been watching or listening on YouTube, Anchor, or any of these syndicated platforms where increasingly trying to provide our presence to, you've learned something valuable, and this has sparked an increased interest in these particular topics, as they might seem esoteric at first, but I can assure you, as someone who spends time with these things, I think that they have a lot of pertinence for our current predicament, and understanding our own current trends and the events that define our present landscape, I think, requires these past civilizations being analyzed and their context being able to be applied into the broader scope for how we interpret modern events and are going to conduct international relations and understand these subjects and put them into proper perspective. But that is how I approach these things, and if you differ from that, let me know, and I'll catch you all in the next segment I make real soon. For now, peace out.